Alrighty. So like I said, we're here focusing on mind-based coping skills today. So we'll have about 45 minutes to talk about a few things, try a few different tactics, and hopefully you'll leave with some options, things to try, some resources here at the end. And so we'll jump right on in. We want just to take a moment to introduce ourselves. And so, like I said, I'm Brooke. I am a doc intern, but I will be transitioning into psychologist here in the counseling center. Just a few things about us as fun little facts, just getting to know us a little bit. And Matt, I'll let you say the same.
Yeah, I'm a staff psychologist. Brooke put her interests, so I put mine. It's fun, right? It's just was kind of the archetype I was hoping for in becoming a psychologist, doing okay there. I love Brussels sprouts and synthesizers. And part of what I really like about these mental skills, one of them is just kind of the awareness and like catching thoughts that are like, huh, that one's a little suspect, and playing with them a bit.
Yeah. And one of my favorites is diffusing, which we'll get to practice today a little bit. So just a few things about this workshop presentation. We're just recognizing that this workshop is through our counseling center, but it's not intended, we don't consider it therapy or therapeutic in nature. It's really much more psychoed. And so recognizing that if this is something that you're needing a little bit more support with, if you're in any kind of emergency situation or need any kind of more mental health support today, that being able to call us would be the best route to go from here. And so we're happy to do that. If you're experiencing any kind of emergency, of course, you can call us, but more importantly, make sure to respond and be able to call 911 or go from there if that's what's going on today. We talked about recording this for our YouTube channel, so feel free to engage in this way, in what way feels comfortable for you, knowing that. And then lastly, thinking about confidentiality, we recognize that we're in this group together talking about these different skills. And so, of course, Matt and I, in a typical therapeutic setting, we have ethical and legal obligations to maintain privacy and confidentiality. But it's knowing that in these spaces, like the one that we're in today, is that we just ask for respect and treating each other with the privacy and respect that we deserve being here. So just being mindful of that, of what you're willing to share, of course, doing only what feels comfortable.
In terms of participation, please feel free to jump in or interrupt at any point. We're highly interruptible. And even though this is being recorded, if you would prefer for it not to be featured in the final product, just let us know in the chat too. This is also all highly editable, so you can come and go without a trace.
Yes. Thank you, Matt. That's right. Some people have more skills than I do in terms of being able to do these edits. So I'm glad for people like you.
Thank you. Is this me?
Yes.
So just to outline what we'll talk about today. One is kind of just a pretty basic but elegant model to kind of situate the skills, right? And this is kind of the model that modern CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, uses. And from that, we're going to look at kind of the nature of interpretation, and how that influences our thoughts. And then give examples of that process in action, and kind of a list of the usual suspects, so that when these things pop up, we can catch them. That's really the first step to all of these skills, is noticing when our mind is acting in a somewhat suspect way. And then after we catch them, then it's, well, what do we do with that? There's a number of things that how we kind of like juggle or turn these things over that are particularly helpful, and being backed by empirical evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to say a little bit about the mindfulness piece?
Yeah, sure. I think so. Matt kind of included mindfulness in what you just shared, of like, it takes a lot of mindfulness for us to recognize what the thoughts are, what's happening. And we'll talk about thoughts, feelings, and how we respond to these things. And mindfulness is more than just interconnectedness, more than just being aware or being Zen or whatever thought comes up for you around mindfulness. A big piece about this process and being able to use mind-based coping skills is being able to know what they are, like what is happening for me, and recognizing and being able to have that awareness of what's going on so that we can be able to use some of those mind-based skills, like diffusion, the idea of like how are we able to maybe diffuse from our thoughts the things that can sometimes really pull us or we feel very attached or they're very believable, and work on being able to recognize when they sometimes aren't believable or that they're not all that helpful. But mindfulness is a really key skill there to be able to know, kind of that old phrase, like you can't fix what you don't know is broken kind of thing. Not that we're saying things are broken, but just recognizing that we need to be able to know what's going on to know what to do with it. And then how acceptance can play into that and how that can be radical. And so this idea of what do we do when we've tried it all, when we've done it all, and all these things, the list of coping skills are there. What's the next step, or what can we do in conjunction with that that can support our well-being? And then being able to wrap up with resources, little time for question, discussion, whatever it is that's helpful. And so throughout, if you want to engage by like turning off your mute, turning on your video, whatever you want to do, there's plenty of opportunities to do that and share with us what your thoughts are, what's coming up for you. I also know that the chat is a good place to like add in your thoughts. And so put stuff in there throughout, like starting, right now, if you're like, what's some of the favorite skills that you utilize to cope, whether it's mind-based or other-based. What do you do that helps you manage stress or anxiety or depression or whatever thing that might be there for you? So we'd love to hear that. And I think it's helpful to hear from other people what it is that they do too, because part of this time is being able to share our resources, share what works for us. And sometimes we can try and hear different things. So we're going to start with the cognitive model. And like Matt said, this is based out of CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, where it's this idea of how you think influences how you feel and behave. And this premise, again, originated out of this theory with the idea that sometimes we go through our life, or I think about this idea of like autopilot, like where have you ever like been at work and you drive home and then you just like are like mentally like, whoa, I don't remember that whole drive. Like I've just been on autopilot this whole time. Or we're just going through the motions. And I think recognizing that, for one, that's just sometimes like what life can look like, and we stay busy and we just kind of go through the tasks that we have, while also recognizing that like this can be really problematic for when we want to address what thoughts aren't helpful for us, or if emotions feel like they're a bit haywire, or they have a little bit more control over us than we want them to have, or if we're acting in ways that we end up maybe later not being happy with, or there's consequences that we're not thrilled about. So recognizing that it's important to know that if we are going through life in this autopilot state, that some of these things can kind of get stuck into some pretty unhelpful cycles. And so we recognize in this model that there's an interplay here, there's an interconnectedness. And we talked about this last week in the emotion-based coping skill workshop. And so if you're curious about that, let me know. We're going to post on our channel soon enough. But we talk about this too, of just like there's this interconnectedness. And I even think that it should maybe not be a triangle. I think it should maybe be like a square or some other bigger shape, because I think also like what we do with our body, also like what happens like when we have emotion or thoughts, how that shows up. And so this is just this diagram and understanding that because they are interconnected, they can influence one another. So for some people, this starts somewhere, or at least research tells us where this oftentimes will start with our emotions, and then that can inform our thoughts, and our thoughts can inform our behaviors, and behaviors can kind of reinforce both of them in different ways. So thinking about this model in this example, so the situation is you have plans with a friend and they cancel at the last minute. And so I feel like that's happened to everybody at some point in their life. And sometimes emotionally, your first thought could be like, I'm hurt, or I'm angry, or I'm frustrated. That might quickly transition into different thoughts, like what a jerk, or like they did it again, or whatever. Or like throw it into the chat what like might pop up for you. I'll be like, gosh, like, are they trying to blow me off? Or like, you sometimes can just go in so many different rabbit holes and in different directions about how we come up with a thought around what happened. Like we come up with some kind of idea of like why this is happening, make sense of it. And then sometimes behaviorally, like we'll be annoyed or We'll be angry, we yell, or sometimes we do the cold shoulder, or maybe we're passive aggressive, or maybe there's something that we do, we text back and be like, fine, I didn't want to, or whatever we do. Maybe we act like it didn't bother us at all, and even though it did. So just realizing how, in this specific example, and these, how this hypothetical person would respond, how these things can interplay. And when we behaviorally will do that and we get frustrated, it might tell our emotion of anger or frustration or irritability. It might be like, yes, you are correct. That is exactly how we should feel. Or the thought is like, yeah, they are. Like, I think about like the self-righteousness that can sometimes come up around like an example like this. And so that behavior can reinforce those other things. It can tell our thoughts, it can tell our emotions that they're right and that they're valid, that they're true. And I think recognizing that the interconnectedness of this model also means that it can go a whole different way. It can go a whole bunch of different directions. So the same situation can occur, and maybe instead, in this case, a different hypothetical situation, the emotions are feeling sad or feeling compassionate, maybe being curious or like understanding right off the bat. Maybe you're just like, I don't know what's going on, but I'm like, I'm worried about my friend, or maybe like, did something come up? Are they okay? Like those kind of thoughts I can feel and look very different. And how those emotions can inform thoughts that can look very different from the first, right? They must have something going on. This, recognizing it probably has nothing to do with our relationship. It is probably purely something that's going on in their life. And they're just responding to that. It's not that they're trying to blow me off. They don't want to not be friends with me anymore. It has nothing to do with me or us. Maybe it has everything to do with what's happening, and how that behaviorally will tell us to be like, okay, like maybe I should check in. Maybe I'm neutral. Maybe I will be like, hey, let's reschedule. Okay, awesome. Like, that's too bad. I'm bummed, but like, hope you're okay. You know what I mean? How that can sound and look so different. And then depending on, of course, what you get back from them, that's going to then maybe tell your emotion, okay, you were correct, or maybe it was this, um, or inform your thought. So when thinking about that, like, how do y'all see the difference between these two? How does that show up and look different for you? Or how do you relate to those two scenarios? And feel free to unmute or throw into the chat.
Like what you mentioned about the self-perpetuating nature of the cycles.
Mm-hmm.
And it can, how the whole structure can veer off to one direction or the other.
Yeah. And I also think that this matters when I say like maybe it's not a triangle, maybe it's a square or something like that. I think about like, we joke about this, but like being hangry, like when you're just like really hungry and your body's not in a good place, or maybe you're just, like you haven't eaten for a while, or maybe you're really tired. How that state of your body and what's happening for you can impact the emotion and where that starts. Like that can set us off in such different directions. I know that I can respond in much vastly different ways when my tank is really empty, metaphorically speaking, to when it's really full. All right, well, I'll keep moving. If folks want to jump in and add more as they go, feel free to.
So we were kind of focusing on the thought component of the triangle and our square, right? And kind of like one aspect of thought, or maybe a main aspect of thought, is interpretation, right? We're making sense of what's going on. And I think Brooke stressed the idea, that first sentence there, that much of this is automatic. Sometimes the situation occurs and then we just kind of feel a certain way, right? It's not necessarily like a voluntary act. It just happens of itself, right? And, usually that's a good thing. Like otherwise there'd be way too much to manage, right? If we had to like consciously interpret everything. So, but I suppose the downside to that is that there are certainly biases in how we interpret situations, right? And sometimes it's those biases or those distortions which give rise to a large proportion of, unpleasant or negative or unhelpful emotion, right? Or further thoughts. So I don't necessarily want you to take my word for it. I'll of course give some examples of that,
Mhm.
right? Um, but I think like the underlying message here is that our minds are awesome, you know, but they're not necessarily to be trusted, you know, unconditionally. Of course, we know that, you know, but it's more of a reminder. And I'm big fan of that phrase. The mind makes an excellent servant, but a lousy master. That'll kind of, you know, serve its own ends rather than ours sometimes. And I don't know, I'd say one of those ends might be, you know, certainty, right? Like who doesn't like certainty and being, you know, comfortable and like this is how things are, you know? And there's a pretty reliable clinical phenomenon that people who tend to be functioning at a more kind of like a lower level, right? That there's because, you know, that's a very uncomfortable place to be, right? And sometimes it's more threatening to um, to embrace uncertainty, right? Because we're already not like we're having difficulty predicting and controlling the environment and ourselves. That introducing additional uncertainty is really threatening,
Mhm.
right? So in that way, I'm just trying to underline this idea that it makes an excellent servant but a lousy master. That it's maybe unpleasant, somewhat, right? To question ourselves in that way when when it's so much tastier to be like, this is the way it is, and my friend's a jerk. Right? Well, not always tastier, but so in addition to that, like some other examples of chronic cognitive biases would be like, was it? It's Aaron Beck and the cognitive triad. You know, he was initially a Freudian, psychoanalyst, right? But he kept noticing he's working with people with depression that they had these common comfortable with uncertainty. Yeah, that cuts across traditions. um, and yeah, what a task. And um, so he was working with people with depression, and he just kind of noticed that, wow, they seem to be really, um, every time that they make interpretations about themselves and their future and the ongoing situation, that they're negative, you know and those are just seem to be kind of like a feature of the mind when it's in this state, right? People who tend not to be as depressed don't show that quite as much, right? The fundamental attribution error, that's a classic social psychology one, right? Where um, uh, instead of attributing, right, or interpreting somebody's behavior in terms of the situation, right? Like if we're driving and somebody cuts us off, right? It's like, well, that's because they're a jerk, right? Or they don't know how to drive, right? As opposed to looking at the situation and maybe the car ahead of them slowed down really quickly, or other interpretations, right? We're we're text messages. Yes.
Mhm.
Um, that's definitely a modern a trial for all of us. There's so much, all those situational cues, right, that we don't have access to.
Sorry.
You might have seen one of the notes there, Kahneman and Tversky, they have a whole list of great cognitive biases. It's a really interesting literature. I encourage you to kind of look into it. Um, and there's a whole uh, number of ways that can lead to like institutional error and like the Bay of Pigs, like military disasters and such. But
Mhm.
I think they won like a Nobel Prize for that work. Any thank you for your observations. Are there any other bits that might be coming up for you, and with this idea of interpretation spontaneously arising that might be prone to error? uh, just a side note, I think I might have bring this one up before, Brooke. We were playing this game with my family where like it's just an association game, and it's like there's a prompt, right? And then you write down your first thought, and if you like match with other people, you get points, right? And it's like the most fun game ever because it really feeds into that idea of like my first impulse is right, you know? And then like consistently as the game went on, there were people like, what, you didn't, that's not the one that you came to you? Like, what's wrong with you?
Yes.
Give me my points.
And then we're right if we match with somebody who also instinctively got to that same place. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think that like recognizing like how much family and like our culture that we exist in and like the different aspects that we're in can influence this so much. Because like I think about like certain like really quick draws that can be like I think interpersonal triggers, for example, of like if someone makes us feel a certain way, like if I feel like patronized, like that could be a very quick like interpretation for me to be like that was disrespectful intentionally, or you know what I mean, like how there are certain things that we may associate really closely with that this like quick fundamental way that we assign our thoughts and reactions that can't, they're not always necessarily true, or that maybe it's just a trigger and it's not necessarily like the truth, or like the danger isn't as there as much as the trigger tells us it is, right? um so yeah, I hear all that, and I think that just considering all these different aspects of how we get to this place, and that we're just human, and humans need to make very quick judgments, and we attribute things so quickly because that is, you know, survivalistic to some degree, to like a very primal, I guess, like back in the day kind of thing. So recognizing that,
Good
I guess
point.
I'll keep
The
us moving.
positive aspect.
Yeah. So I think as we think about this automatic thing that Matt is, this process that Matt is alluding to, is that we can sometimes, again, without mindfulness, which we'll talk about a little bit later, without mindfulness, we can get really quickly stuck or get into these cycles of thinking patterns that aren't necessarily true, valid, helpful, accurate, insert word that makes it like unhelpful even. And so we're going to go through a few of these really common ones that we talk with folks about. And I'm curious um, if anything is popping up for you as like, oh, I'm really relating to that. So throw it into the chat or feel free to unmute. But a few things that can come up really easily that we find, again, this orients out of the CBT approach is all or nothing thinking of when you find yourself using words like either or all or nothing, like black and white thinking sometimes is what it's used to, is this idea that like I'm either a wonderful person and human, I'm the best, I'm so kind, or I'm like the worst, like I am terrible, um, like mean, monster, whatever that is, like how that can just be one or the other. Or it's like I'm an awesome student, or I should drop out now, or I should, you know, how that can swiftly, or I'm, you know, the best partner to the I'm don't deserve to be with anyone kind of thing, and how our brain can sometimes really like pull apart in that way. Um, Overgeneralizing is this like one thing happens. I kind of call it like the snowball effect. I think about I grew up in like the Midwest where we got a lot of snow and we live on a hill and you start a snowball at the top and you just roll it down the hill and it would just pack itself. And by the time you got to the bottom, it was huge snowballs. And so I think of like overgeneralizing as like that snowball of like something, one small thing can happen. And what our brains can do, especially with anxiety, I think too, is that it can just become really big. Nothing good ever happens, or I never get this right, or you always do this. I think that sometimes those words can definitely be an indicator of overgeneralizing. I'll hear folks like students, so sometimes they'll be like, I failed my first test. Like, man, that was really hard. I wasn't expecting how hard that was. And that fear of now, like, am I going to fail everything? Am I going to be able to sleep? You know, am I going to be able to do this? Should I change my majors? So thinking about how quickly that can really get out of hand and be unhelpful or just plainly untrue. You know, one thing does not mean that all of it is also true. Mental filtering or disqualifying the positive, thinking about, I think in either direction, like I think about receiving feedback. You know, you might get a whole slew of like, these are all the awesome things you did. Maybe you're getting just all of these responses, but the only thing that your brain focuses on is like, whoop, right to the negative, right? I think about that a lot. And it's really easy And I think again, it's survivalistic in a lot of ways to kind of know where's the threat. I'm going to draw to that. But recognizing that, like, if we're filtering out a lot of other things that are happening, for example, like if you have a lot of things that are going on in your life that are really troubling or challenging or upsetting or has really brought you down, it's been a heck of a year. Thinking about, like, it can get really easy to then filter out what else could be happening at that same time and see just those things that are kind of drawing our attention. And missing that there's sometimes a balance, or that missing that there's some good days and some bad, or whatever that looks like. Jumping to conclusions, again, kind of mind reading or fortune telling. I think of this one as like when you're like, oh, they think this of me, or this person, or, they thought I was a jerk, or they hated me, or, what I mean? This idea of like mind reading, where, like, again, there's sometimes that piece of like social cue and like knowing how people think of you because of behaviors, but also like we can't read minds. We don't know how people are thinking about us. We don't know what people, they may or may not be making those judgments, or if they are, they maybe aren't as bad as what we're imagining they are, or as critical as we think that they are. Or fortune telling, where I know that this is what's going to happen. Here's the thing: this thing happened, and then now I know that this is going to happen. Just, let me tell you how it's going to go. And when we hear those kind of things, where we recognize those kind of things, knowing that, wait a second, I really can't tell, and I think about like classic, kind of like a sports psychology or performance psychology premise, is that if you're focusing on the fortune of what you think is going to happen, or what you maybe even don't want to happen, and you're thinking about that and focusing on it, you're more likely to fall right into that path. We are much more likely to kind of go right there because that's what we're thinking about. So that can get us into some unhelpful patterns. Any other thoughts or things to add here? Okay, well, there's more. There's a few more here. Catastrophizing and minimizing. Sometimes it's blowing things really big out of proportion. Again, think about the state in which you're in. I also think about like trauma and cortisol levels, and like stress and all these things that can really like make that happen. It's not just our thoughts. I don't want to, invalidate what that process can look like. But sometimes recognizing, like, are we blowing things into really big proportions, or are we sometimes minimizing for whatever reason, like inappropriately or unhelpful way. Emotional reasoning and labeling. I feel embarrassed. The idea of, in our first workshop, we talked about emotions, obviously, and so this idea of like emotions are really good data, but how we feel emotion sometimes is not just as simple as that. We feel an emotion, but then we like add some kind of label to it, or we like will sometimes have a secondary emotion, which will, I feel embarrassed. Maybe the next feeling is like shame, or I feel guilt, or I feel whatever. And that can be something that I think can label us. We can label ourselves with unhelpful terms, or reason around our emotions. So just because we feel embarrassed doesn't mean that we're an idiot, or that we don't know, or that we should, that we should never do that again, or we should never try that, or whatever. And just recognizing that emotion can just exist, right? And so we talk a lot about that in the first one. Shitting on yourself is this idea of like, how critical are we being in this blaming voice, in this harsh voice that, one, isn't helpful, two, isn't really serving us, isn't more likely to help us get to where we want to be. And so that's just kind of an unhelpful just pattern in general. And personalizing, if something goes wrong or something feels off, or if we're interpreting things a certain way, that we make it very much personalized about who we are and our fault and our abilities, and like the core of our being. And so just recognizing that sometimes things exist, or we do things, and it doesn't necessarily shine a light on who we are. So if anything's popping out to you, I'm curious what that looks like. But I just want to point out that all of these things can happen to all degrees. I think everyone does it. It all depends on what are your, I'm a big catastrophizer. I'll have to stop myself and be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. I started a long ways away and now I'm here. I got to slow down. And so I think everyone falls in, we have certain patterns that we can fall into really easily.
So once we have a we're developing our list of the usual suspects, right? Suspect thoughts, suspect interpretations, habits, right? Well, what do we do with that? Here are a few of those hows. And just for shorthand, I think this comes from a treatment protocol for people with schizophrenia. It's a nice succinct version: is catch it, check it, and change it. you know. And there is a certain, like, you can do a certain gamification of this process. The more that you might catch in a day, the more, I don't know, like credits you earn, or whatever, like, you might level up, you know. Uh, we need to, so, uh, we need to encourage our progress, have some way of doing that. So,
Mhm.
and I put butterflies on there because I don't know, it's fun to catch butterflies, and they're somewhat elusive, you know, much like these thoughts. Sometimes we're on top of our game and we're just netting them left and right, and other times can't swing and hit just, the broadside of a barn. Um, Unfortunate thing. Our, our levels of confidence fluctuate sometimes, or awareness for that matter.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, and adding on that, like, I think just being compassionate about, like, there's going to be days where you can catch them really easily, and giving yourself patience and whatever it is that you need to do, like some kind of nurturance to, like, just recognize that sometimes the thoughts they're just so quick, and I call it muscle memory. Like, sometimes it's so fast and so easy and so believable, and or this takes a little extra energy, or it's new for us to think about catching them and checking them and changing them to be something more realistic. I'm realizing that I'm having this thought. I know it's, maybe it's personalization. Now I know that it's not, like, how do I change? Like, that process it's unfamiliar. So I think the more you also practice it, the easier it can get. And so I think, like any sport, the more you do it, like catching butterflies is your sport, I guess, or whatever it is, the more you do it, the easier and quicker you can get to do that. Those skills are, it's muscle memory. We become better at it as we do it. So just recognizing that there's a lot of reasons why some days we're gonna get tripped up really easily, or it's really hard to not catch it until much later. That's okay. Come back to it and keep practicing.
It seems like we have a little bit of a older audience, and so y'all probably have more experience in catching butterflies, than some of the undergraduate students that we usually work with. So you might be, instead of catching butterflies, period, you might be looking for the spotted, I don't know, whatever. This
We
particular.
clearly don't know anything about butterflies, do we?
So let's say we catch one, a new one. We're like, oh, look at that. So what are we what are we going to do with that? We'll go over three ways, right? One, evidence and multiple interpretations, right? Basically, we just want to build flexibility around the interpretive, construct. So when these present, and a lot of those distortions are very much one-sided, right? So this process of, oh, that thought really hurt, let's take a look at both sides evidence, right? Usually, we'll spontaneously, like, dredge up evidence in support, right, of that, right? I think bringing up evidence in contrary to that can be like the disconfirming evidence, always elusive, be the key step there. That's why the judge is there, with evidence for and against, balanced. Um, and kind of sometimes, if we're lucky, or the hope in that, in so doing, right, that initial emotional reaction, right, because that's what we're doing. We want to be as clear as possible in our thinking and as accurate, but we also want to feel good. Right, so we're leveraging that thought part of the triangle into the behavior and emotion in particular, right? So hopefully, if we, like, go over that evidence, right, get more balanced, then we might feel a little bit better, then often that also just the more intense and, like, a negative emotion like sadness or anxiety, the more self-confirming it gets, right? And the harder it is, like, kind of pull out of that, right? So hopefully in doing that process, we might be one notch or two notches less intense, and we might, have more wiggle room in general. Um, and, like, the shorthand of that, so that's kind of a long process, right? We capture it. What's the situation? What's my interpretation? What's the evidence for that? What's the evidence against that? How am I feeling now? Right? That's probably the most involved we can get, but it's also the most rigorous, right? Um, for shorthand, we just, like, let's look for alternative interpretations. What else could be going on here, right? Those might not ring as true because I might not have the emotional oomph that fits our sort of history and biases quite as well. But if we can keep juggling those, then we're probably in a somewhat better position, right? What would a friend say in this situation? Oh, that's a great one, especially for those of us who are like quite self-critical, right? We might beat ourselves up worse than any friend or enemy we can imagine.
Mhm.
Um, I might hold myself for unreasonable or double standard, right? Kind of a similar vein there. Is this all helpful? We'll get to that one in a bit. Can we go on to the next one? And of course, like likelihood is is along the lines of accuracy, right? Especially if there's a feared outcome, right? Like Brooke said, in terms of like sports, we're going to kind of like our blinders are going to be like we're just seeing that feared outcome.
Mhm.
And the example I often use in this one is there's this great American Horror Story episode where like these witches had to like save a friend who was trapped in hell, and they like drank this potion or whatever, and they went into hell, right, where they would face their like worst fears, and they're like, before you drink the potion, like don't get trapped there. They didn't really say how not to get trapped there. They're just like don't. It's like, oh great, thanks. But so they each went into their own like history and like worst memory, and like the one who got stuck there was like dissecting a frog. They had to like kill the frog and dissect it over and over again, right? And that's that idea of like the likelihood or like the presence of this worst case scenario in our mind is just ever present. It's like being stuck in hell. That stinks, right?
Mhm.
So we want to, if we can, engage those systems of, okay, what's the likelihood of that, compared to other outcomes? Do I have to be that geared up about this particular one? Right. And that does take a certain oomph to jump out of hell to engage those systems,
Mhm.
um, but can be quite useful. So just like evidence for and against, we're probably focused on the worst outcome. What's the best, right? What's the most likely, somewhere in between, right? It's also reassuring. Two, and this is kind of around tolerance, and this gets into exposure and sort of like facing our fears, because we can't just discount that worst case or that feared scenario, right? We're fearing it for a reason, probably a good reason, right? So maybe next best thing is, and sometimes in getting stuck there, we don't like go to the next day, like we don't go to the next class after dissecting the frog, right? It's over. So we can go. It's like instead of moving away from the feared scenario, right, or trying to make it not come true, we can go into it, right? That's exposure, that's mastery, and it's like, well, if that happened, would I be able to get through it? What would things be like in a week, in a month, in a year, right? That one can be a little bit risky depending on the particular fear, right? So I don't think that's necessarily a blanket useful one because there's some that are just horrible, right? But even so, it's worth a shot. During for example, during the pandemic, which is still going on, my car was doing some like, some strange noises on the wintry Boone wintry, 421. And I was just like, oh man, this car's going to break down. I'm going to be frozen out there. And then when the tow truck driver comes, he's going to have COVID and I'm going to be stuck in the thing. And oh gosh. And then I was like, well, okay, what if that happened? Okay, well, maybe I'd get it and my entire day would be ruined and I'd be ill. I'd probably be okay. Maybe, I'm not sure. Okay. And it's like on my way to the grocery store. It was a much more pleasurable drive.
And I think when you just to speak to like what you're doing in 2 weeks, Matt, is the behavior one, the behavior workshop is that like you'll talk a little bit more about like this idea of exposure and kind of facing that more directly and head on. So if any of this like is resonating with people, I just want to put that out there that like in 2 weeks, Matt will be talking kind of diving a little bit more into some of these pieces of facing it and coping with that. So just putting that little plug out there.
Thank you. And lastly, usefulness, right? Our mind is I don't know, I feel like it's a tool organ, and that it has a job to do, right? And it needs to be accurate. It needs to be helpful to us. right? And part of this, the unfortunate nature of it, there's certain pitfalls and certain whirlpools that we get sucked up into, and it's like worry, right? So the student or person studying there has all these things going through their mind, scenarios, is, and that it's one of the definitions of worry is short-circuited problem solving, right? We have these things queued up, and they have the lure that they're going to be useful to us, and they're going to prepare, and the plans are going to be good, but we just end up jumping from one thing to another, right? If we find ourselves in that situation and we see it, that's such a great excuse to be able to, or great reason actually, to be able to disengage from that whole process and be like, this is not serving the task of the moment, or even the near future. It's just gobbledygook, you know, um, or you know, or we could say, well, I'm just so upset about this right now, and my mind isn't really focusing, at top of its game. Let's change it up and come back later. These things aren't going anywhere. If I change it up and maybe come back, maybe it'll be more useful, right? I don't know if you can kind of relate to that idea that sometimes when the mind gets going, it really has this promise that it's going to be useful eventually. Um, so if that's the lure, then yeah, put it to the test. How useful is this to me right now?
Mhm. Yeah. Or like set a timer, even like give yourself 10 minutes, worry for that amount of time. If you haven't gotten to any place that's helpful, then maybe that's your cue. Like, all right, I'm gonna do something else. I'm gonna disengage. I'm gonna do something different. You know, things like that. Something to kind of mix it up. But yeah, turn that off.
Exactly.
So we have inadvertently been talking about mindfulness throughout this whole last 45 minutes or so, because all of these skills require this acknowledgement of what's happening in our head at any given moment without being carried away by it. So often we'll use the metaphor of like if you're sitting in front of a stream and recognizing that on a fall day there might be some leaves that fall down into the water and they just kind of go with the water, imagining that those are your thoughts, that you're sitting there on the bank. And this is like a visualization exercise that a lot of people will do. And there's so many out there, we could find, or you can find, or if you need a suggestion, like we always have them. But like thinking about how powerful could it be to sit on the side of the bank of the creek or the river and be able to just recognize it, like, oh, that's a thought, like, oh, that's a pretty red leaf thought, or oh, that's a pretty yellow leaf thought, and to see that go by. And like even as you're looking at it and recognizing it, that mindfulness of like, oh, I recognize that's what's there, or that's what's happening. um, there's a difference between seeing it and recognizing it. And again, like we talked about at the beginning, of like latching onto it, right? If we see it from this, again, like objectively, like a leaf, then like we're able to kind of look at it and observe it and almost like, we can describe it. We can be objective about it. We can even criticize it, because it's not, we're not attached to it. And so this process is really ongoing, and it's a big piece of mindfulness is non-judgmentalness around what you're doing. I think about like in all honesty, I struggle a lot with mindfulness and slowing down and being present with myself, without the judgment of like, oh man, this is so hard. Why is it so hard for me? And or like, just sitting and breathing. And there's different ways of doing mindfulness. I think mindful activity is really like what resonates with me, for example. But just recognizing like non-judgment is a big part of this, of like just it's just knowing what's going on. It's just acknowledging it. It's just being able to see it, just being able to know it. Um, and not judging ourselves for it or beating ourselves up. But you think about the shitting on yourself, the unhelpful thinking thought pattern that we talked about earlier. We don't need to add judgment or shame or criticism to it. Just recognize that it's there. It's there for a reason. It's maybe not there for a reason. Maybe it's just not even useful at all. And just recognize that. Um, and our minds will continuously think. I think so often people are like, I just want all these thoughts to slow down. I want to, like not have any more intrusive thoughts. And I'm like, that's what we do. That's what our brains do. I think it's this idea that like we're always going to have continuous thinking. That's what Matt said. We have the short looped circuit of worry. It's thoughts. It's what about this? What about that? How, it depends on our executive functioning too. Like we might just have thoughts just pouring in all the time. So I think that recognizing that they're going to be there, no matter what. And there's certain skills that you can do and things you can try to take care of yourself and your mind and body and spirit and soul and all these things. But just know that like this is a natural process. And so mindfulness is just like, I'm going to be more attentive to that process. I just want to kind of observe it, and be able to take a minute. Maybe it's 10 seconds. Maybe it's just one really good breath. And then you jump into your next thing that you have at work or the next class or the next call or whatever you have going on. Which kind of brings us to diffusion. And so this idea of kind of what I was hinting at is this idea of getting untangled from our thoughts. So like like if you're visualizing this, we think about those like little finger traps that you can get where you would stick your finger in each side of them, and as you pull and try to get your fingers out of the trap, it's just going to tighten and it keeps your fingers stuck in the trap. But the trick is, of course, is to be able to just like not force it, and maybe even like you have to like kind of push your fingers toward each other before it can release. And so it's the idea that sometimes we naturally and understandably may not like the thoughts, or, again, we're recognizing they're not helpful. So maybe we're frustrated or have some kind of relationship with the thought that's happening. And recognize maybe we're really good at labeling it now. Maybe we were like, I know that thinking pattern and I'm able to label it, but you know what I mean? And this idea of being flexible with not feeling so attached to it or feeling judgment around having them, and being able to just recognize that if I keep fighting it, that sometimes it sticks around more. Like if I'm like, gosh, I hate this thought, I just wanted to stop thinking about this thought, but all we're doing is thinking about that thought. Like if I was like, no matter what you do in this exact moment, I want everyone, I'm going to tell you one animal, don't think about that animal no matter what you do. Try it. Your absolute darndest not to do it. And it's like a fluffy white like bunny. Like you're probably just going to think about a fluffy white bunny. And so our thoughts can just so easily stay connected to that. And so this idea is being able to just observe it, recognize that it's not attached to you, it's not who you are, it's not your brain or your mind or what's wrong with you. It's just the thing that's there. It's the leaf that's passing. It's something that is a part of our existence, a part of our thought process, but doesn't mean that it is necessarily connected. And so this can work really well with depressed thoughts. Like when Matt talked about that depressed triad of, it's really easy to get caught into loops of like thinking about negative things about myself and the world and the future, and realizing that like diffusion might be like, I'm having a thought about the world, is terrible. Or I'm having the thought that I don't feel like, I'm not happy with myself today. I think just literally adding that tiny little specifier in can be really powerful in this practice of, I'm having the thought that insert, like I'm thinking blank, not just I am blank, or this is true, or this is right. And so it's part of that practice. It works with the self-worth. It's really easy to like hear that critical voice that can be in our heads, and recognizing that like that's just a thought. It's just something that's passing through. We do lots of weird, wacky things with our brains. It goes in different directions, and so it doesn't necessarily mean it's true or accurate. Same for ruminative, same for worried, how we can kind of get stuck in those loops. And so I'm realizing that we don't have a lot of time. We only have 7 minutes. And so I want to, we were going to use this, but this is, on YouTube. If you are interested in this, and, write down maybe the title if you would like. But if you're like, hey, I didn't get that, put your email into the chat, and I'm more than happy to just like send the slides and you can get this if that's helpful. So is that okay, Matt, if we just kind of move forward? Okay, I just want to make sure we have plenty of time. Oh, just
this
kidding.
activity is
It's like, no, I'm going to blend. And then this last piece. So we talked about a lot of different things today of what you can try, what you can do, how to feel like you have more mastery over your brain, and feel more in control of your own mind. And I think that part of this process is also that we can do a lot. I think our culture, or at least like I think about like Western culture, is often like, do more, do this thing, it's not doing enough, or just different expectations that can be there. And we can always add to this list. There's always a list of coping we can add. And sometimes it's sometimes really very toxic positivity is like, do more, like fix this, do this thing. And sometimes that's not helpful, or it's really harmful actually. or it just really minimizes or suppresses what's happening or how we're feeling or what our experience is. And I think that part of this, which is a really hard thing to accept and acknowledge, that pill that we talk about swallowing sometimes, is sometimes we're just going to really have some painful thoughts, or we're just going to have some painful emotions or challenging emotions, or our thoughts are not that supportive and loving and kind and helpful, or that we react in ways that we're not proud of, and we can work on that. But I think existing in that space of knowing that when it comes to what we can do, sometimes a really powerful thing is radically accepting that we can just accept how we feel and what's happening, and that it is what it is, without fighting that or trying to change it. And there's a lot of like interesting like research that talks about like that psychological well-being of being able to not turn what pain is, and the pain that is really unavoidable about sometimes human existence, into suffering. Like we can feel pain and we can feel that, but do we need to continue latching into it? Do we need to continue fighting it? And that can turn into suffering. And would it be powerful? Would it be helpful? We're not going to just lay over and kind of be like, oh, I'm just going to accept it, and it is what it is. Like I can't do anything about it. Even like feelings of hopelessness, it's almost like I'm going to choose to just be, okay with that. This is going to be the case for me today, or that maybe this is what I'm feeling in this moment. I maybe don't even have to make sense of it. I know sometimes it's hard to not, like, I want to reason with why this is happening. Even that, like how powerful and radical is it to just accept that we are going to feel this way, and that maybe it doesn't make a lot of sense, or maybe it does make sense, but it's okay. And I'm going to validate that. I'm going to sit with it, and I'm not going to fight it. That picture of like, we can feel different ways about rain, and it's like, yep, it's raining. Yep, that's what's happening. And it feels a bit like I'm not as overcome by it. When these thoughts happen or these emotions come over me, I'm not going to feel overwhelmed. I'm just going to choose to think about, sitting with that. It brings me to the first workshop around emotions. We talk about just recognizing and allowing, accepting, and a lot of that practice with our emotions. And I think that this ties into that really nicely. Of, by no means are we saying stop trying. By no means are we saying, let's not do the things that are within our control. And sometimes this is a really powerful tool to add into our repertoire. Anything you want to add to that, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes we can be overwhelmed. Like sometimes the intensity of the feeling might just surpass our ability to cope with it, even with
Mm-hmm.
acceptance. You know, and that happens. It's not necessarily like our fault there. Sometimes things are just bigger than us. Um, I, I also kind of think of it as like um, sometimes there's like an impulse, right, to like frantically make something like a feeling or a thought that we're having go away, right? And like in that franticness, we're almost like perpetuating it, like don't want this, can't have it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that if you're not experienced in embracing acceptance, like simply making that internal move to, well, let me try to hold this for a while, see what that's like, you know. After it's like all the strategies that we've done so far are change oriented, right? Let me look at the evidence. Let me identify the bias. Let me correct that bias and feel better, right? But at a certain point, we just reach like, well, this is probably as good as I'm going to feel. I still don't feel that great. So I can maybe, having done that, give up temporarily, if I'm willing to experiment with that, give up this change agenda, and embrace a little bit of um, acceptance, practice it. It's definitely a move. It's definitely a skill, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And like these other things, like Brooke said, we get better at over time. Our holding capacity in terms of what we can have going on with us as we practice this levels up, and it's really, really pretty fun. It's like, wow, I could be really sad and angry. Congratulations.
Oh man, therapists are funny. But yeah. It's true. We can practice the capacity of holding and allowing. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and that is pretty courageous. And so just a few take home points for today. I hope that there's something that resonated with you. I think that there are so many different approaches here. And even if you took away just like one snippet, hopefully it resonates in the area that feels like a good place to start. And sometimes I think that's the best place to start is like what's comfortable, what feels very doable, go there and feel like that feels comfortable and I feel good at this, and then like add to it. Maybe balance it. Maybe if you're only doing mental coping skills, like add in some emotion, add in some body, add in like, you know what I mean? Like round out that approach. Because, you know, like, for example, if our bodies are not in a state that we can do the mental skills here, then like it's going to be really hard. And so just want to recognize that like there comes like to be sometimes an order of things of the sort. And so just recognizing the balance that we sometimes need in applying these. So we have a lot of resources. We want to make sure that you get. Feel free to take a picture of the slide here, or again, I can send these here at the counseling center. We are still functioning and seeing folks. If you need any support from us, of course, if you are faculty or staff, that would be a different location you'd be getting support from. But more than happy to make sure you get connected no matter what. We're happy to consult and do that as well. And so lastly is just please give us feedback if you can, if you're willing, if you have the time. It'd be really important to us to get that for Matt and I for the counseling center so that we know what's working, you know, how do we make this presentation better, but also like what are the things that are helpful to just offer in general to the campus. So that would be awesome. And we'd so appreciate that if you're willing to do it. So that's the QR code if you need that. And then we have, I'll keep up the share for just a minute longer. And then next week, Wednesday at 3 p.m. is the third workshop, and that's body-based coping skills. We're doing that one a hybrid. And so we plan to do that an online version if that's the best way to join us. We're also doing it on Sanford Mall, and so we're going to do body-based. So it's going to be a lot of breathing and different ways that we can do things with our body that can help us cope with everything else we were talking about. I'm going to stop sharing and going to add the link. Also, if the QR code wasn't working for you, there is the Google Doc if you're willing to give us some feedback. Again, we appreciate it. Any questions or thoughts or things or comments that anybody has? If not, we're so glad you joined us.
Thanks for coming.
Awesome.
I might want to reiterate that point, Brooke, that you made, that sometimes the mind skills, they are a little bit tougher if we're in a really emotionally sort of like dysregulated space.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd probably recommend going for the body or emotion-based ones if it's difficult to concentrate.
Definitely check out our YouTube channel in like 2 weeks, and we'll have we'll have them up there. So thanks everybody.